Now we come to totalitarianism as it begins to arrive in Germany, and the rise of the Nationalsozialist Deutsche Arbeiterspartei, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. When I ask those friends of mine who occasionally ask, well, isn't Nazism right wing? What part of National Socialist German Workers' Party don't you understand? Remember, I advocate the use of the functional scale of government, which has anarchy on one side, totalitarianism on the other, and liberty in the middle, as opposed to the sort of propagandistic scale of government, which is the classical one taught in political science courses, where fascism is on the, communism is on the left, fascism is on the right, and liberal democracy is in the middle. Communism and fascism may have different qualities in many respects, but they govern as totalitarians, with government having all power. And that functional scale, where you have a government with all power, liberal democracy in the middle, and a government with no power and anarchy, is, I think, more reflective of actual reality. In any case, like Italy, Germany is a country of grievances. Oh, speaking of grievances, the Japanese are not happy with a number of things. Particularly, they're not happy with the Western notion of white supremacy. Now, the West didn't invent racism. Far from it. If you know anything about Japanese history or Korean history, the idea of being part of an elevated, special, super race is absolutely suffused into both Korean and Japanese culture. And they're not the only ones. In fact, the kind of race pride that Europeans become notorious for in the late 18 and early 1900s arguably came through the same process that absolute monarchy came when it inspired medieval Christian kings to consider the Japanese emperor and the Chinese emperor as role models for achieving total power over their societies. But it is true that the Europeans of the early 20th century and late 19th century do see things in racial terms. They assume superiority of Caucasians over Asiatics, Middle Easterners, Africans, and Latin Americans, and Indians, Native Americans in general, and Pacific Islanders. The assumption is based on the fact that Europe is the first society, the first region to industrialize. And certain things are connected to the European belief in the just innate superiority of Europeans. To the point where, famously in Shanghai, China, there was a park, this is in Shanghai, China, that had a sign and a rule, no dogs or Chinamen allowed in this park in China. This is something the Chinese Communist Party brings up whenever they want to stoke anti-Western fever. The Japanese try to address this through the Treaty of Versailles and the establishment of a racial equality clause in the founding documents of the League of Nations. But the Europeans refuse to go along with this, and the Japanese feel slighted. They feel that even though they've become more Western than the Westerners, even though their empire dominates China like the Western empires, even though their navy and their army has beaten both Russians and Germans, that they're not taken as seriously as they might be because they're Oriental rather than Occidental. So that set of grievances does stew and help the rise of totalitarian tendencies in Japan. But the grievances in Germany are going to make the rise of something like Nazism almost inevitable. First off, the Germans do not accept that they lost the war fair and square, which isn't true. In October 1918, there was the Black Day of the German Army, where the German Army basically became incapable of effectively fighting the war. And General Ludendorff, who ran the details of the war as Hindenburg's chief of staff, and even Field Marshal Hindenburg and the Kaiser had to accept that the army could do no more. And this is when things began to go towards the Kaiser abdicating. By this point, the government had changed hands, and a socialist premier named Friedrich Ebert was the one who sent the negotiators to set up the armistice for November 11th, 1918, and the cessation of hostilities. The Kaiser leaves. Now, all of this had been prompted by a food shortage brought about by the British blockade and food riots that had overturned the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and threatened to overturn civil society in Germany and possibly replace it with a communist police state. So, how do the Germans explain this to themselves? Well, people on the right say, our troops didn't lose the war. They were stabbed in the back by the dirty Jews and the socialists and the communists and the other traitors. Rather than understand how the war ground down the German spirit and the German economy to the point where they literally couldn't fight as an army anymore, where the economy that supported the army was crumbling, rather than accept the reality that they were just beaten, they tell themselves this fantasy that we was robbed, we was stabbed in the back by Jews, socialists, and traitors. Because if we were stabbed in the back, defeat isn't our fault. It's not our responsibility. It is something that was done to us. We are victims of unfairness. And we have been treated unjustly. We deserve better. Rather than the kind of cold, sober reflection that a defeated party should feel after a war, what did we do wrong? What was wrong with us? How could we change to avoid the same thing happening in the future? Instead of all that, it's we was robbed by traitors. We were stabbed in the back. Add to the stab in the back theory, which allows Germans to escape both moral and rational responsibility for their defeat in the war, there is the war guilt clause of the Versailles Treaty, which says that Germans have to accept that Germans caused World War I, which they didn't. But the treaty has to have the Germans accept that they are guilty of causing the war, because that's the only way that the Treaty of Versailles will allow Germany to be fined with indemnities, so that the German people will pay for the war and pay the British and French, who can then pay the American bankers that they borrowed massive amounts of money from. But these are Germans, and they're not happy with accepting guilt for something that isn't their fault. A Greek or an Italian of typical cultural aspect would say, who cares? It's just words. It's just talk. It'll brush off. Nobody cares. What matters is reality, not words. But Germans, as a cultural trait, must have things in Ordnung, in order, and to accept moral responsibility for something that isn't their fault just goes against the grain. It bothers them. The stab in the back and war guilt, plus the indemnities themselves. Indemnities, remember, being a fine that you pay when you lose a war. So, the German economy is already weak because they'd lost a war. Their wealth was spent on bombs and guns. Many of their skilled workforce are dead or crippled. And yet, the German economy is going to have to pay for the war. Now, France was given an indemnity after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, and even though that indemnity was expected to cripple France's economy for a decade or more, they paid it off in half the time. Because, as difficult as the Franco-Prussian War was to the French, it wasn't World War I. The difference is like the difference between a candle being ignited and a hydrogen bomb. The hydrogen bomb is World War I. Germany is much more devastated by World War I than France was by the Franco-Prussian War. So unlike France, the Germans are not going to be able to easily pay off the massive indemnities that the Allies assigned to them because they're guilty for the war, according to the treaty. So not only do the Germans believe they were betrayed by traitors, not only do they believe that rightly that they were asked to accept responsibility for something that wasn't their fault, but their economy is being impoverished by a vampire leech sucking the value of Germany's economy every year in the form of these war debts. I think we'll leave things there, and we will continue with disarmament in the next lecture.